Hello. We are alive. So, hi, everyone. I'm Orbit Senior Editor Bradley Englert, and I'm excited to be here today with four awesome Orbit authors. So, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, heroes, anti-heroes, and sort of everyone in between. So, I'm a pretty big fan of anti-heroes, and I think knowing what you all write, that you all will know a lot about that as well. We put together a great panel to discuss this topic. So, I'll start with some questions that we put together beforehand, and then we'll jump into audience questions later on. So that video right before this showed, but there's a question box off to the side where you can enter your questions. So if you start posting them now, everyone can vote on their favorites, and then the top voted ones move to the top. So it's easier for us to sort of see and respond to them from there. And there'll also be a replay of the event that goes live right after we wrap up. If you miss anything or if you have to go in the middle, don't worry about it. You can always come back later and watch the rest of it. So I'm going to start with a really quick bio of everyone, and then we'll jump into it. So first, I'll start with Brent. So Brent Weeks is the New York Times bestselling author of the Night Angel and Lightbringer series of fantasy novels. His latest is Night Angel Nemesis, the first new novel in the Night Angel series in 15 years. It's out from Orbit at the end of April. Andrea Stewart is the author of the Goodreads Choice Compton Crook and British Fantasy Award nominated The Bone Shard Daughter and its sequels, The Bone Shard Emperor and The Bone Shard War, which is out from Orbit later in April as well. And I saw that someone is already reading an ARC of that, which is very exciting. C.L. Clark is the author of the Nebula, Ignite, and Locus Award nominated The Unbroken and its sequel, The Faithless, which came out from Orbit in March. And Justin Lee Anderson is the author of the forthcoming epic fantasy novel, The Lost War, which is the winner of the self-published fantasy blog off and will be out in May. So welcome, everyone. So I think to get started, what I'll have everybody do is just sort of do a brief pitch of your book. We're sort of pitching things to people all the time, pitching to readers all the time. So I'm going to have you all pitch your books, which is really easy to condense, like 800 pages of epic fantasy into one elevator pitch. So Justin, I'm going to put you on the spot first. Give us your elevator pitch for The Lost War.
Ouch. Okay, The Lost War is an epic fantasy mystery conspiracy road trip with a D&D vibe set in a country based on my home city of Edinburgh with a lot of Scottish atmosphere and influence.
Awesome. I will kick it over to you, Sheree. I think you are muted. I'll bounce over to Andrea while we sort out technical difficulties quickly.
Yeah, sure. So the Drowning Empire series is an Asian-inspired epic fantasy that is set on an archipelago of migratory islands, and it follows 5 point-of-view characters. There's a daughter who's trying to reclaim her rightful place as heir. There's a smuggler who professes not to care but can't seem to stop doing good things. There are 2 women in an established relationship who are trying to deal with the class differences between them. And then there's a stranger on a remote island who's trying to uncover why she's there and how she got there because she doesn't know. So this is all in the backdrop of a brewing revolution and a magic system that's inspired by computer programming.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Welcome back.
I think my headphones had a short in them. So The Unbroken and The Faithless and a third book eventually are basically about Terrain and Luca. Terrain, who is a conscripted soldier for this empire, and Luca, who is the imperial princess, and how they both reckon with relevant to our panel today, how they both reckon with the crimes that they commit in their line of duty, as well as what you do when your duty merges with family and more holistic duties like loving people versus killing people, in a nutshell.
Very intense. Awesome. So now Brent, Night Angel Nemesis.
You guys are all so good, I can't compete, so I'll just say magic ninjas.
It's the shortest one and probably the most, it's very straightforward. Cool. So I'll just dive into some of the questions that I prepped beforehand, which are all about sort of character development. So let's start with sort of the biggest question, which is how do you craft a sort of a nuanced and heroic character, which is a very large question that I've condensed into like 3 words. I think we need to start there to sort of establish what we all view as heroes so we can get into what an anti-hero means to us. And so starting with you, Brent, in the Night Angel series, for example, sort of Logan Geyer is our very classical heroic character, despite he, in the original trilogy, he does sort of go through the ringer and get put through a lot of difficult trials and has to make some shocking choices. But to me, he feels sort of, quote unquote, classic heroic character. So what makes a good hero to you?
Well, I shouldn't tell people this, but Bradley let me cheat, and he told me that this question was coming. And I've been spending like the last hour to try to make my answer not be an hour long. So I think by a good hero we could mean 3 different things at least, and maybe numerous of them at the same time. So do we mean a good hero as in an effective character to drive a plot forward? Do we mean a character whom readers like to be with, or at least enjoy watching? Or do we mean a morally good and heroic character? And if you guys will give me like 2 minutes, I think, well, probably 3, I'll use a real life story to illustrate. So there's a young prince. He's being groomed for power, this real historical character. He's about 17 years old, and his father is murdered. Doesn't know who killed his father. All of a sudden, he's trying to survive in a world that is a very adult world. It's full of violence. His mother has sky-high expectations for him. And when I say sky-high, I mean literally sky-high. She thinks that her son is descended from Hercules, and that if he wants to go to basically to Greek heaven, he needs to equal great-grandpa. He needs to equal Hercules. So that's what his mom expects of him. So he goes out. He has his very dubious generals. He wins a couple of battles. Comes into this town. There is a cart tied up, and people say this cart's been here for hundreds of years. Only the person who's going to conquer all of Asia can loose this cart. And they look at him because he's the conqueror who's supposed to lead his men. And everybody's like, okay, Alex, get the cart. And he goes up there and he looks at this, and the knots were really intricate in the first place, but it's been outside for several hundred years. So it's either made with goat leather, or some people say that the ropes are made with cornel bark. And over the hundreds of years, they've fused. So even if he could have untied the things in the beginning, it's not untieable any longer. And so he looks at it, and his men and his generals are looking at him, and he plans to lead these people into Asia, what they knew of as Asia at the time. He's got to do this. Everybody looks at him. He looks at it. He realizes it's impossible, and he takes out his sword and he cuts the knot. Right, and that's the story of the Gordian knot. So Alexander, is he an effective hero? Alexander the Great, is he an effective hero to drive the plot of your story? Well, he's dynamic, he's decisive, he's extroverted, he's excellent in numerous ways. And usually in plots, I think we mean characters who are intelligent or charismatic, often surprising. Is Alexander all of those things? Absolutely. Secondly, by a good hero, I think we could mean someone whom readers like. And one of the best ways to do that, sorry, I skipped one thing. Somebody who has clear goals. So obviously he has a clear goal. He's got a, for fiction things, clear goals are very helpful because they either succeed or fail. Is he somebody who characters like, or who readers like? Do you want to spend time with this person? And I think to some ways that we do that, some ways that we cheat to do that is we make sure that we have problems that readers can identify with. Now, Alexander the Great's problem, his main problem, is take over the world. Well, okay, that's not a great problem for us to identify with, but I think we can all. If I were writing Alexander the Great, I would write him. I would put him as a young adult suddenly thrust into an adult world. He doesn't know how anything works, and he feels totally overwhelmed. That's kind of how I felt when I got out of college, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is so unfair. All these systems are set up. They all want me to fail. Secondly, if we surround characters with really unfair circumstances, so people are mean to you for no reason. Maybe people want to murder you, or maybe just you're Harry Potter and your family is miserable to you, like for no good reason. Harry's really nice, and his aunt's family is awful. That makes us kind of root for a character. So then, thirdly, a good hero, we can mean somebody who's morally good, and here I think Alexander the Great is working on a different morality system, so that's a little bit more on the nuanced side of things. But in general, I could go there, but it takes a long time, so I'm not going to. In general, we like characters. We think of characters as morally good. I think cross-culturally, I could be wrong here. Correct me if I'm wrong, or you know, go ahead and fight with me on any of these. I'm fine to be proved wrong. A character who uses their power or their excellence to help others, often at a cost to themselves. And often we would show this early on in a story, that this is the kind of character who helps out other people. So that's being self-sacrificing. And then laterally, they're somebody who, if we mean a morally good hero, somebody who doesn't take the easy way out, but does the right thing. And that's a character who resists temptation. So if you have a character who embodies some or many of those things, then I think you've got a good hero.
Yeah, that's a lot to process at the moment. So I'm going to make it easy on myself and actually make it difficult for one of you. I'm going to kick it over to you, Andrea. Do you have any other thoughts on what makes a hero, either bouncing off of what Brent has said or your own sort of thoughts on crafting a heroic character?
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at strictly a heroic character, I definitely, to me, that means like a Paladin-like character, to kind of go off the D&D classes, where they have a very strong moral code and then they stick to that nearly no matter what. To me, that's like kind of like a classical heroic character. I feel like even heroic characters do have flaws, or, you know, points where they sorry, there's something in the background, where they break down, or they make mistakes, or maybe go away from their moral code, but they stick very strongly to it. And that's kind of what I see as a heroic character.
Cool. Sheree, same thing. Morally coded, like very sort of staunch morals, etc.
I agree that there's something very fascinating for me about heroes who have to, you know, there's the element of self-sacrifice or the element of temptation, especially with paladin types. Like I love somebody who's like this close to like leaving their god for something that is like sacrosanct. Just this close, like that teetering line is so excellent. But yeah, also like those are the things that really get me in a story. Is the sacrifice and the temptation, like whether they fall or don't fall to temptation for me. In terms of just like narrative hero, I would also say I like the problems have to be interesting. They don't need to be like world-shaking stakes or something, but they have to be something that makes me pay attention. And that sometimes is as simple as, you know, the proverbial cat. If I like the cat enough, and the hero saves the cat, then it's great. That's a great way to get me invested, and I would probably read an entire story about saving a cat if the author got me invested properly in this little cat in distress. So
yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think it is, the stakes matter, but it's really sort of, do you like reading about this character, or is that sort of the conflict doesn't have to be sort of world shattering, which is often what can be thought of in epic fantasy. The sort of small scale stuff can really do a lot of work for you, depending on sort of the character development. And Justin, we'll close with. Oh, sorry. No.
I just remembered like the perfect example is not a cat, it's a puppy. And then if you like the puppy enough, you get John Wick, and we have 4 movies now. So.
Yeah. We have 4 very awesome movies now. Cool, Justin. Any additional thoughts on?
I don't know if it's particularly additional. I was thinking about this while, particularly while Brent was talking about sort of his criteria. I think the thing that makes a hero an effective hero is sort of a number of things. They have to be, I think they have to feel like a real person. They have to feel deep and nuanced and like somebody you could actually physically, relate to, and which means they have to be relatable as well. And I think equally, you have to want to spend time with them, and you have to care about them. And I think once you if you get those 4 factors in, if you get somebody who feels real, is interesting, you care about them, and you want to spend time with them, then you will have somebody who can be the heroic center of the book. In terms of a real sort of heroic character of a hero, Andrea mentioned about a sort of paladin-like character. I have one in the Lost War named Samily. She's a holy knight trained to fight demons, and she is sort of what you would consider quite a traditionally heroic character who will always make the right choice and always chooses the good thing and always does what she thinks is right. And one of the ways that I've kind of played with making her more interesting and adding some depth to that is that as the series goes on, I mean, we're obviously the second book is in editing now, so there's more story coming. But part of what she has to contend with is she's thrown in with this group of people who are much more morally grey than her, and to different degrees, is whether she sees the world too clearly in black and white, whether she's too rigid in what she sees as right and wrong and good and bad. And I think that's just sort of one example of a way that you can make that interesting.
Yeah, I think that heroes have codes is one of the things. I guess this might be getting a little bit ahead, but heroes have codes and like villains don't. And then anti-heroes are kind of like bad guys with codes.
Yeah, that does branch into sort of the next question that I'd pre-prepped, which is just, and actually the morally gray part of it, and the sort of villains with codes part of anti-heroes is what actually makes a good anti-hero for you versus a villain, I guess. And so for me, it's kind of like how everybody's story is different. And so from someone's perspective, this is an anti-hero or this is a villain, sort of depending on what you're coming at it from. And so the example that I had just immediately to sort of kick us off was Joel from The Last of Us. I think he's like a perfect example of an anti-hero, or from his perspective and sort of Ellie's perspective, he's the hero for a lot of the story. But especially if you play The Last of Us 2, from other people's perspective, he is very much an anti-hero, not to put any spoilers in there. So Brent, I'll start with you again. Kind of what makes an interesting anti-hero to you? Is it sort of that exploration of the moral grayness, or is it giving someone codes and having them break those codes, or sort of what ticks the boxes for you on an anti-hero? Brent, you are muted.
I'm far more interesting on mute, actually. I don't categorize characters, mentally in usually in these stark terms. Like I tend to think of characters as not morally gray, but as I need to come up with the perfect metaphor for this, but like shot through with black and white. And it's only as you recede into the distance where you don't have the clarity, where it looks gray from far enough away, but they're an amalgam of both good and bad actions. And so you can take a character who's pretty darn good, like Logan, and even Logan messes up, and he's got places where he's a mess, and he's got places where he can grow. And Justin, like in your book, it's like he starts out really well. He's got this, or he starts out with very clear parameters on what good and bad are. And if you don't fit in the good for him, it's like you're out of here, because he cares about justice. He's a very black and white thinker. And when I was building him, when I was thinking about him, I was thinking like part of my thought process was what kind of young man could grow up to be a great king. And it's got to be somebody who cares about justice, right? Like they have to care about justice. What kind of flaws is a young man who really has, where justice is an overriding moral that matters to them? What kind of flaws are they going to have as a young man? Well, young people have flaws, right? Like if that's really important to you, you go, man, you're either good or you're bad. Boom. And that's kind of helpful in a king who doesn't say, it all depends. Depends on what I want today. So I do the same thing with I try to have all of my characters have kind of a range of views, a range of worldview, even like what they believe about the world, what they've accepted is true, how the world works. You know, if you believe you've got to lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead in politics, then you give that person a great goal, like you say, look, we are going to be invaded, and we need to be together by the time we get invaded. And they believe that thing about the world, that you got to lie, cheat, steal to get ahead in politics. They're going to say, okay, my end is so important that I've got to get there. The means is not important. I'm gonna unite us regardless. And that's kind of what you get with an Andros Guile character in the Lightbringer series. It's like, I have to take charge because I'm the only one who can do this, and it doesn't matter what I do to you on the way. And is he concerned that he hurts people on the way there? He's not concerned about that because he thinks his goal is good. So he is a bit anti-heroic, I guess. There, I think you're right, Sheree, of that. It's somebody who has a moral code, and it might not be one we agree with, but that's one of the things I really like about writing, is that we can really put ourselves into other people's shoes in ways that I don't think into depths that I don't think any other form of media can really do, because we can see how people understand themselves fully. So that's my first stab. Sorry, I'll stop talking. Going on too long here.
No, that's all super interesting. I mean, there's a lot of Andros in particular, and a lot of the characters that you're right sort of exist in that very nuanced way of, and you give us a lot of time to explore all of them as well, which is very interesting. I think that's important. Justin, I'll kick it over to you on your thoughts on Antiheroes. Justin, you are also muted.
Everybody has to do that at least once, right? I was just quickly, I was trying to quickly find a tweet there that I read earlier today from Rob Hayes that was just so perfect for this. And it was basically, I was talking about Antiheroes. It was basically saying, you know, I'm not going to relate to somebody who is absolutely perfect all the time and makes all the right decisions. I want somebody who has flaws that I can relate to, and flaws that that they struggle with, and because that's what makes them interesting. And I think in some ways that can be the core of how you begin to build somebody who's an anti-hero who, you know, has lots of flaws, and initially at least maybe gives into them, and you know, and their actions are not heroic, and they are, you know, you could even see them as a villain to begin with. But I think with all that said, going back to what I said at the end of the last question, again, if they feel real, and part of that means giving them I think if somebody makes decisions that are clearly wrong objectively, but if you can understand why they made them, if you can see how they got to that point and go, actually, yeah, I kind of see that, then it starts to become interesting. Then they become a really interesting kind of anti-hero. An example that I was thinking of was, I can't remember the character's name, but she was the antagonist in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series Marvel did. And basically, she was kind of fighting for refugees, and everything that she was fighting for seemed pretty reasonable. You could kind of understand it. And then she blew up a lot of people, and you're, well, hang on. At this point, I need to start thinking about whether I agree with you or not. So I think, you know, again, relatable, feels real. And with an anti-hero, can you kind of see where they're coming from? Can you understand why they made the decisions they did? And if you can then see them kind of, you know, a redemption arc's always good fun, but I think sometimes not having a redemption arc for somebody and having them just be true to themselves can also be really interesting, or not true to themselves, but true to who they've always been when presented with the opportunity for a redemption arc can actually be interesting too.
Yeah, I love that idea of I think we all like a redemption arc, but occasionally it just doesn't feel real to the story, and I think that's what you want to like make sure you're achieving. Andrea, any additional thoughts?
Well, I missed it because I didn't realize that my computer had become unplugged, so it ran out of batteries. You know, I had made just a couple notes about this, but I think it sounds like some of it was covered already, where I feel like an anti-hero just needs to be relatable and understandable. I mean, a lot of times when I read a really good anti-hero, I can see like, oh, you know, I could maybe see myself behaving that way had I had those particular circumstances come up. And I think that's part of what makes them so interesting, is because there's that very thin line that you feel like it's possible for somebody who is very good and heroic to just cross for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. It is this sort of when someone makes a choice and then you realize in yourself, oh, that might be something that I would do. And then how do I feel about that? I always think that's interesting. Sheree, any additional?
I mean, I like to lean right into that exact feeling. So when I'm looking for anti-heroes I want to read about, or when I'm writing them myself, something that I often end up drifting into is, are they doing something that I would love to do if I were not bound by the strictures of society's law codes, etc.? Like, there are a lot of people who I will not do anything illegal to, just for, disclaimer, but who I have really strong feelings about. And if I were in one of these fantasy worlds, I would probably zap them. And while I cannot do that, anti-heroes can. And there's something really thrilling about being able to watch justice be enacted in a way that even the in-narrative heroes might not be comfortable with, but the anti-heroes don't really care at all. They're like, yeah, that guy was mean to me. I didn't like it. There's just something really thrilling about that. So that's just one of the things that I'm really drawn to in that.
Yeah, what am I? Oh, sorry, Brent, go ahead.
There's fun things that you can do with anti-heroes too, which I think one of the most fun things I ever did in writing was I had a character who was good, and he'd been good for 2 books, and he'd come from a bad culture, but he'd made really good choices for a long time. And then in the third Night Angel book, he starts to make worse choices, and it makes sense all the way along. And I think readers do this thing where they like a character, and it's like that character becomes your friend, and then you kind of make excuses for them morally. When they do things that are a little questionable, you kind of go, yeah, okay, well, as long as the character, they're doing bad things, but they feel bad about it, we tend to forgive them. And so I wanted to take this character, and I'm like, can I take this good person and can I make them into a very dark character and have the readers only tear away from this guy who's actually doing increasingly awful things. This is Dorian throughout the book. And then look back and be like, wait, I was kind of okay with this guy when he was doing some really awful stuff because I understood why he was doing it. I was in his head. It made sense to me. He had to do it for all these good reasons. And I was apologizing for, I was defending my friend as he was doing stuff that was objectively awful. And then on your second read, you're like, actually, this was wrong too, much earlier than when you pull away. And you're like, I was okay with my friend doing all this awful shit because they're my friend, and so it allows, so an anti-hero can make us turn a mirror and hold up a mirror to the audience and say, really, you were okay with this? You were okay with, this massacre, you were fine with this? This dude raped somebody. You're okay with that? At what point did you tear away from that when that person was your friend? And how do you feel about yourself afterwards? So an anti-hero can make us ask uncomfortable questions. I think whether it's what things do I want to do to my enemies, but I just don't do it because, like you were saying, Sheree, I don't do it because I'm held by the strictures of either my own morality or the society I'm in, and I'd get caught. Or deeper things of what would we let our friends get away with? Would we turn in our friends to the police when they did X, Y, or Z? And so I love that pushing into that discomfort, and anti-heroes let us do that.
That's really interesting, but that's made me think of a conversation I had with somebody about The Walking Dead and Rick and Negan in The Walking Dead. I don't know if you guys have seen or read The Walking Dead, but basically, you get to a storyline where Rick's the hero and Negan is the villain, and then actually somebody's, well, if you flip it around, if we'd been watching this from the beginning and Negan was the hero, Rick would be the villain. They're both morally corrupted in different ways. We're rooting for him because we've been with him all along, but if we'd been with him all along, we'd be rooting for him instead. And it's that's really valid. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, well, that kind of builds into something else I was thinking about, which is sort of how do you decide the quote unquote likableness of your character? And I don't really mean that in the way of like, I like this character. It's just how do you sort of their readability and how do you connect the reader with them and how do you craft sort of an interesting character? And I think what everyone is bringing up is sort of adding in that sort of darker depths to characters. But for you, when you're approaching sort of a character that you know is going to go to dark places or maybe make some choices that have readers disagreeing with them or a little upset, how do you balance that sort of struggle when you're writing? And I'll start with Sheree.
So that's actually something I think quite a lot about, because I think my characters, especially Terrain and Luca, polarize a lot of people for that exact reason. So I think for some people they're very likable and understandable, and for other people they're absolutely not. And I think first off, like that is totally normal and very exciting for me as a writer. To know that I have polarized people in such a way that makes me feel like the characters themselves are very strong and defined. But it also, I think that's kind of, I don't know, a danger in the idea of when readers are trying to find someone that they identify with and like. But for me, more important than people being able to identify with them was always like, if someone is aware of the situations that the characters are coming from, part of that is on me as a writer to put in the world. And some of that is also just like what kinds of backgrounds the readers have, what they're bringing into the book with them as they read. And given what's in the text, can they at least, and I think we've mentioned this before, can they at least understand how they've come to this conclusion? Do they feel human enough for the mistakes that they are making? My characters are, I don't know if I would call them intelligent heroes. I think their virtues lie elsewhere, maybe if they have them. But they are like doing their best. I think that's the kicker for me, is that they are doing their best, like with what they have or what they think they have. They are making every possible effort to make the best choice in their situation. That best choice is going to get them some kind of need or want. And that may fall on one side or another or somewhere in the middle as far as morality goes. But one of the things that I do when I'm actually writing them is they have some kind of want. And it could be a pretty big want, but it might not be like what they're eventually going to find out is their deep, deep need. And then there's some kind of morality that must be tipped when they have to sacrifice that want for that need. And you know, it's not necessarily something that's going to be so easy as like, you know, I want to be morally upstanding and not kill people, but to save this person, I have to kill somebody. It's not like something that that simple, but to be good in one way is one thing, but to be true or to be honest or to do what is most right to me, which is not necessarily, again, good, but to do what is truest to me, I would have to sacrifice this particular moral good or part of myself. And I think that understanding that trajectory, whether someone's a hero or anti-hero or villain even, is one of the things that's most important to me in terms of figuring out if I want to follow a character as a writer and as a reader.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense of that sort of like you just become so invested in them and want to see where their journey will take them next, even if they are sort of making decisions that you disagree with, depending on the situation in the world around them. Justin, I'll pass along to you.
I was just I was so engaged listening to what Sheree was saying. I've actually forgotten what the original question was.
Just sort of how you, yeah, how you sort of like develop the sort of readability of your characters, that sort of like page turning nature of the situations you put them in and the choices that they make, and sort of where, for you, at what point you're thinking, oh, this is why I'm excited to write about this character.
Okay, yeah. So I think it goes back to kind of what I was saying about you have to be able to see where things come from. I had difficulties going without spoilers, so I won't go into too much detail. But there's a thing that one of my characters does, and I really was conscious of the fact that it would seem out of character unless I kind of earned that for them. So I had to make sure that I seeded that as I was going along through the storyline. And actually, one of my early readers sort of said, because there's a couple of characters in there who are dealing with various mental health problems, basically. And I want to say, I don't know if this is, you're maybe focusing on this a little bit too much. And I was like, yeah, but if I don't make it clear that this is the justification for what they then do later, then that's going to seem like it came out of nowhere and it's going to not feel real. So I think what was important for me in that was that there was a progression that you could trace, even if you didn't see it while you were going, even if you didn't see the path while you were walking it, basically. You could get to the destination and turn around and go, oh yeah, no, I see how we got here. This makes sense. And I think that's important. I think, if you're gonna have characters act in morally dubious ways, particularly one who's previously been, as Brent was saying, your friend that you're prepared to justify, you kind of need to be able to see the breadcrumbs that led them to doing what they do.
Yeah. Andrea, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Like I liked what Brent said about how it's kind of like having a friend who goes off and does bad things. And I think that's part of writing a character like that. Is I kind of think about it how I think of like YC news items, and I see the comments where it's like people are like, well, you know what? I would never do that. So this person is bad. But then if you have a friend that has done something like that, you kind of like understand a little bit more of like, oh, their background and what might have led them to that. And then on the far end of that spectrum, you have people who are like your best friends or like your children, where it's like, I will never abandon you, like no matter what you do. And I think when you want to write like a really, really good anti-hero, you want to get people on that side of that spectrum where they just are so invested in this character and love them so much that they are kind of willing to forgive a lot of what they do. And I do think that it's important to note that that's going to be different for every reader. Like some readers are going to be along for the ride and really, really like this character. And some people are just going to, want to toss them aside at the first like moral failing that they have. And I think that that's okay. And I think that you have to kind of judge like where you want to fall. Like it's instead of thinking like that you want it to be a character that appeals to everybody, because I think that's kind of impossible. Like Sheree was saying before, like some people I'm sure are like, oh yeah, like I understand Luca more, or or I understand Terrain more, and it is very polarizing. So yeah, I think you're just not going to appeal to everybody, especially if you're writing a very strong anti-hero.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a fine sort of line to walk. Brent, I'll circle back to you for any. We kind of like we're gravitating around your initial input on anti-heroes, but do you have any other thoughts on sort of the page turning nature of characters that you craft?
So this is going to sound really, really out there, and I hate it when artists do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Mozart said, "Love, love, love. That is the soul of genius." And to me, I have to love my characters, even the ones like even the villains. I'll ask myself, what was this guy like as a kid? What was this girl like as a little girl? Who was she then, before she went through, or before she made the choices she made, or where did she come from that turned her into this, or where she thought this is acceptable, or she thought this is the good, this is the thing that I will do that is a good action, and people will do really awful things and think they're good. And so I try to understand them on their own terms, and without saying like what they say is good is the good. So I'm holding those two things at the same time. Like they can make morally horrendous choices that I think are wrong, but I can walk through that with them. And so I have a lot of conversations actually with my wife about characters. I'm like, I'm trying to do this. It would be really convenient for the plot if this character would do this thing because I planned all these things over here, and she won't do it. Like this is not who she is right now. She doesn't feel like I can make her do that, and I can just shoehorn that in and just have her do it so the plot works out. And it's like I always have to stop and I slow down and say, who is she? Who is she at core? And here my own boredom really helps me out. It's like, okay, if I've seen it 100 times, readers have seen it 100 times too. And I just assume a sophistication of the readers that they've seen everything that I've seen too, and they know all the tropes too. So I want to sit there with this character until I can be like, here's a reason why this works, or with this little tweak, this character becomes the character who would do that. And then I go back and I fix the thing and I tweak it like Justin was talking about. Sometimes there's something that needs to be added, or the character will just do exactly the same thing as some other character will do. And then we don't have a diversity of experience within the cast. So I'm always trying to make characters like, is this character too much like another character that I've written before? Is this character too easy to write because it's just the same character with a new name slapped on it? And then if it is, it's like, okay, let's slow down, let's dig deeper, let's think of other ways to write this character. So I try to understand that character, I try to get into their skin, and then I try to love them even through their flaws. And then I think they feel a little more real to the readers because it comes out of that. Because actually now I've slowed down, and this is why my books take so long, dang it. It's like I slowed down to get to really know the character as a real person myself. And then I think that just flows out of that time I've spent with them, asking them questions, figuring out who they are. And then it comes to the readers that like, oh, this person feels real to me.
That actually really nicely segues into one of our audience questions. So Merrick asks, do you begin creating characters by thinking about psychology or something else entirely? And I think you hit on that a little bit, Brent, with sort of like talking about their journey in a way. And I sometimes I think about, Sheree, you were mentioning sort of the world building can affect the character as well. So I'll start with Justin here on this one. So for starting, when you're creating a character, sort of where do you start with that? Is it the psychology? Is it the world building? Is it sort of the character archetype that you need, or is it something else entirely?
Well, for the Lost War, for the characters for the Eden Saga, I completely cheated because I started with characters who friends and I had been role playing for a really long time, and they part of the reason I wrote the book was because I wanted to write a book with those characters. That was one of the things that drew me to it. So I kind of had archetypes which were sort of you had the basic characteristics of the character, and then I kind of initially projected some of the personality of the person who played the character onto them. So I had the bones of characters to start with. And actually what was interesting was that as I was writing the story, I found myself wanting the character to go develop in a certain way, but thinking, well, that's not true to that person. And I actually had to sort of sit and divorce myself at that point and go, these are no longer these people. These are no longer, they were the basis of what I want to do with them, but now I can make them more. And what I did with that eventually was really similar to what Brent was saying, is they kind of had to live in my head and develop and become real people and real characters that I could relate, that I knew what they would do in a given situation. So I guess, in answer to the question, I guess the answer is not necessarily any one of them. For me, it's almost like they begin to form and they become interesting. Something about them is interesting. Something about them makes them stand out. And then I think, the more they live in my head, the more they grow arms and legs, metaphorically, to the point where, now, if for example, my tried and true method for getting out of writer's block is, if I'm not quite sure what's going to happen next, I will actually sit down. I will list all my main characters, and my notes will be, where are they right now? What are they thinking about? How are they feeling? And the important thing that always fixes it is, with that all in mind, what are they motivated to do next? And once I know what once I understand what each of the characters is motivated to do next, then the story easily continues because I know what people want to do. I know what they're going to do. I know how they're going to react. And I think if you can get to that point with them, it's almost an evolution of making them interesting, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Andrea, did you have thoughts on starting a character?
You're muted.
Oh, Andrea, you are muted.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah. So just like Justin, too, a lot of these things I kind of end up developing at the same time, and they kind of bounce off of one another. But when I sit down to think about my characters, the two main things I think about are like, what do they want? And then what's stopping them from getting what they want? And that kind of can build into things like what their past was like, and where they're going, what the arc of their character is going to be. And then also I think about their voice. So like how is their point of view going to sound? Like are they funny? Are they irreverent? Are they grumpy? Like what is like the sound of this character? Like if I was going to sit down and just chat with them, like what would they sound like? So those are the kind of like the building blocks that I use for characters. And then you just I just expand it from there, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So especially when I'm reading something or editing anything, I think what you said about voice is always extremely important. And I think you can just know who a character is if you can know who a character is from just a few lines of either internal dialogue or regular dialogue or monologue or anything like that, then that's like the sign of a really good character and really good character development. So I think that's a great point. Sheree, did you have anything that you'd like to add on?
Not a whole lot, just that in addition to some of the other stuff, like when I've actually got a character started, when I'm really first starting it, usually it comes in hand with the world, because as I figure out whatever is the driving question, sometimes it's world based, like it's a magic system or a government system, or sometimes it's just a generic character problem. And then I have to figure out who the person is around it and flesh out the world in which something like that could happen. And so the world and the character are very symbiotic in that way. And so I build a little of each, and then I build a little of the other, and a little more, and a little of the other, and so on. Like with The Unbroken, I knew I wanted to write about colonialism in fantasy, which is a very broad, general situation. But I kept having this vision of a soldier who had to kill her own people, like at an execution. And I was like, okay, cool. But I had no idea who like Terrain actually was. But I was like, okay, well, this is a situation. So how did this world come to be? Or like, why is she even in this position? And then I got to go back further down into who she was to be in this position, and then back out and back in and back out and back in.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. The world building and sort of having the idea, but then wanting to how they interplay with each other and kind of evolve off of each other is really interesting. Brent, we kind of started this with you, but I'll circle back in case you had any additional thoughts as the conversation.
Like I frequently start with like either a moral problem or just a character building problem, like either something that's bothering me that bothers me, like why do we let countries do things that we don't let humans do, like just war theory, you know, so that would be embodied in a king. Why can a king do certain things and it's moral or it's acceptable, but if a dude just did it, it would be totally wrong, like, you know, going to war, killing lots of people. Well, that's never, ever acceptable for just a human to do, but somehow we're okay with kings doing it or countries doing it. So embodying that. Or another character had genesis of, is it possible to be a moral assassin? And what happens to a person if they're an assassin and they're a basically reasonably moral human being? How would that person come about? How would that, and Sheree, I did the world building around that. A lot of the world building had to be like, well, this person would have to find themselves in a really awful situation where the authorities are not doing what they're supposed to, and everybody who should look out for you is not looking out for you. and then the world sort of built off of that. And then I'll also take things like at what point when your friend is doing something evil will you actually pull away from it and call it evil? And that was the Dorian thing. Or can I make you actually root for a character who's killed a character that you really, really love? So I give myself these mini problems that are challenges for myself as a writer, and I go, well, that sounds hard and interesting, and let's see if I can do that with this character. So that's often the genesis for me.
Yeah, I asked myself, like, can you make enemies to lovers, but like enemies, not like rivals, but like they are enemies, and if so, how would it work? And could they actually end up together? And if so, how? And if not, how bad can it get?
That's a great setup. Love that.
Yeah, I honestly think those kinds of questions are what make a lot of stories so compelling, because as the reader, you're like, you want to find out the answer to that too.
Awesome. Cool. I think we're nearing the hour mark, so I'll wrap up with, this is a really good question to sort of very quickly run through, but who is your favorite anti-hero in fiction if you had to narrow it down to one anti-hero? Justin, I'll start with you.
I mean, I don't know if he counts as an anti-hero, but he certainly does a lot of things that would qualify as an anti-hero, but I would say probably Logan Ninefingers, because you can't help but like him. He's charismatic. And I think that's something I meant to say earlier. Charismatic will make an anti-hero work pretty much. If you can start with charismatic, you've probably got a winning anti-hero. But yeah, Logan Ninefingers, a lot of the stuff he does is just morally reprehensible, down to the point of just really selfish, awful decisions, barring the stuff where he ends up actually murdering people that you care about. But you still just find him compelling, and he's a great character.
Brent, favorite anti-hero? Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Well, I'll go for the deep cut. Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost. Milton Satan is basically, he's got all the heroic virtues that you think of. He's defiant. I mean, he's kind of like an American. He rejects authority. He's defiant. He's smart. He's charismatic. People follow him. Like people said, Milton kind of fell in love with Satan in this thing. And I personally think Milton has some things to say about what we value in our heroes or in our culture. So he's playing some games there.
Sure, I think I cut you off. Were you jumping in?
Yeah, I was going to say that when I also thought about this question, a lot of my top answers were Joe Abercrombie characters. And Logan was not my first, though. He was a little lower on the list. I think my all-time favorite is Monza Monscaro from Best Served Cold. Like a quest for vengeance with like a side of like, definitely didn't see it coming, but should have seen it coming. I'm not going to spoil it, but based on a relationship she had with another character, I was just like, oh, but also I can't bring myself to care quite enough, even though I'm really disturbed, because you also just like went through a line of your enemies and showed them who's boss. Like it was just so effective. But also just pretty much any Abercrombie book, you're going to find somebody that you hate to love.
Yeah, we didn't really get into it, but I love a revenge story, and I think you can get really interesting anti-heroes in a revenge story. I think John Wick came up earlier, and that sort of slots right in with that sort of story of vengeance, and you go along with them for a lot of it, and then there are certain points where you're like, oh, I don't know if you have to sort of walk yourself back from enjoying what all is happening in sort of revenge stories, but I definitely have a huge soft spot for them. Andrea, favorite anti-hero?
Oh, I'd have to say Walter White from Breaking Bad. I love how he starts out so like pathetic in a lot of ways, and also like very relatable. Like you're like, oh yeah, I can understand why he's going and he's making meth. Like he's got to pay his medical bills. And, I just remember a scene in the beginning where he's like out in the middle of the desert in his tighty whities and he's like balding, and it's just like, and he goes from that to this, like, it's really this incredibly scary character. And I just loved that journey where you're kind of just on board with him for so long until you start like questioning, like, wait, should I still be on board? And it's interesting too, to kind of think like where everyone kind of drops off.
Yeah, that's a really great pool. I didn't think about Walter, but that's a really, really good answer. And what a fantastic character. Cool. So my last question now is, what's something you've read, watched, or listened to lately that you have loved? And I'll just start with you again, Justin, and we'll go in sort of the same order.
Oh, what have I read? Quite a lot of things. The first thing I think of that jumps out at me that I've read recently that I really liked was Daughter of Red Winter by Ed McDonald. It's really good. Really enjoyed it. It's a little different from his previous series, Blackwing, but the heroine has all the signs of becoming a really interesting anti-hero, actually. So that fits in quite well. So yeah, Daughter of Red Winter.
Awesome. Brent, favorite thing recently?
I actually just discovered Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There's a relatively new translation by Simon Armitage, who's English poet laureate, and it's like it was basically this forgotten poem. It was like they forgot about it. It was gone for 200 years. Didn't really affect English literature at all, and then like you find it, and I'm reading this just thinking, it's just some crappy old story, and it's only valuable because it's old, right? And it's like, actually, this has got a lot going on, and I really loved it. And then the verse translation that Simon Armitage does is also just stellar. So that's kind of a weird cut, but there we go.
Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting story. I had a professor in college who was like, that was what she studied and was obsessed with it, and it was so interesting learning from her and sort of doing a deep dive into that. And it is just like very heavy fantasy. So it's cool. That's interesting. Sure, favorite thing.
Recently, I just finished it's a sequel. It's called Thick as Thieves by MJ Kuhn. The first one, Among Thieves, I listened to an audiobook and I really loved it because it was just hilarious to listen to. But in terms of anti-heroes, it's basically a gaggle of thieves or otherwise morally questionable people getting together to do a heist. And we've got like the makeup artist, we've got the magic user, we've got the bruiser, we've got the person with the getaway vehicle. Sometimes it's a ship, sometimes it's a cart, whatever, it's not important. And the second book, Thick as Thieves, just really goes to show how far each of the characters is willing to go, like really pushing the limits of anti-hero-ness in terms of how they sacrifice each other, how they sacrifice other people that they care about, how they sacrifice their actual goals, or what temptation they fall into. So very relevant and really good.
Cool. And Andrea, favorite thing?
I'm going to go with something that I watched recently, and it was Andor. So I was like pretty blasé about like, oh gosh, yeah, another Star Wars property. Like, yeah, I guess I'll sit down and watch it because my husband works on Star Wars games. But I was just completely blown away. Like the writing is impeccable. The characterization is amazing. Like after every episode, I was like, oh my God, it has no right to be this good. It's like, usually you think of Star Wars and it's like passable and it's fun, but this is just absolutely incredible. And there is a really, really great anti-hero character in there who is basically like the mastermind over the rebellion. And it really just kind of gets into all the sacrifices and the terrible decisions that he has to make. It's just, it's amazing. I would highly recommend it.
I actually looked up who had written a couple of those episodes because I thought a couple of those episodes were absolutely fantastic, and it was the guy who had written House of Cards. And some scandals, disappeared for a little while, and then he sort of came back and wrote a couple episodes for them, and I was like, oh. Because I was like, oh, this is a young guy. He must be starting out. I'm going to tweet him. And like, oh, this guy's got some scandals. But I was like, yeah, I agree with you, Andrea. It was like some of those episodes are just great. So.
Yeah. Stellan Skarsgård's speech on the bridge when he's like, burning amazing. My future, burning my life for a future I'll never see. It was like, oh, what a great line. What a great speech.
That's awesome. Cool. So we are at the hour mark, so we will close. But before we do that, I will go in the same circle again and sort of ask what's coming up next for you. So Justin, what's up next?
Well, The Lost War's out in May, in just over a month, and then The Bitter Crown, the sequel, is out at the end of the year, and that's the first 2 of the 4-book series.
They're amazing. I will vouch for them. They're very, very good. So look forward to those. Brent,
I'm glad you're enjoying them. It would be pretty miserable if you weren't.
Yeah, that would be bad for both of us. But no, they're so good. I love those books. So Brent, what is next for you?
I'm working on the next book. I'm doing a lot of research. I'm doing some. I'm picking at some problems to see, is that an impossible problem, or can I figure my way out through that for some ideas I have. So still in Night Age world. So.
Awesome. Sheree?
While I wait on edits for book 3 of The Magic of the Lost, and the final one, I'm working on a secondary kind of later orbit project called Warmongers, which is also very anti-hero-ful. It's about 2 women who at one point were kind of brothers in arms and lovers, and then one betrays the other, and so several years down the line, when one is turned into their country's god king, the other is like, all right, I guess it's time to end things.
Very cool. And Andrea?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. So I'm working on a new trilogy right now called The Gods Below. And it centers around 2 sisters who are separated by a cataclysmic event and end up on opposite sides of a clandestine war. I've been describing it as both deeply romantic and deeply unsettling. So be prepared for some body horror, basically.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks everyone for watching. This was a really great conversation.
So wait, Bradley, what are you working on right now?
Well, Night Angel Nemesis comes out soon. I'm very excited about that.
No, I wasn't doing that. I wasn't doing that.
A lot of things coming out very far from now, as editors always are. The one thing I will plug is I'm currently working on revisions of Relics of Ruin. So it's the second book in a trilogy. The first book was called Empire of Exiles by Aaron M. Evans. And it's a really, really, really amazing locked room mystery in a fantasy world. And if you love like super detailed world building, kind of oddball characters that get in way over their heads with a mystery, and just a very compelling page-turning mystery, I think you'll love it. So yeah, I'm working on the sequel for that right now, and that will be out later this year.
Cool. Nice.
Awesome. I think we are good to go, so we can wave goodbye and we will disappear from everyone's screen.